For part 2 of this lecture, we will discuss major endocrine glands of the body and their function. There is a lot of information in this section. However, for this course and this class, I want for students to focus on 3 broad categories. And as long as you know that information for each of these endocrine glands, you will do well. So know where they are located, be able to identify where they are located, what type of broad hormones that they produce, and what the function is, what is their end result. So if you can categorize for those 3 categories, you will do well. So first, let's look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is located right here, almost anterior to the midbrain, and below this structure, the corpus callosum and the cerebrum, and almost slightly inferior and posterior, we have the pituitary gland located right there. So again, the pituitary gland shown right here. We discussed how the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus and some other organs are also part of the diencephalon in the brain. Pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk called infundibulum. So the pituitary gland has 2 components, an anterior component and a posterior component. The posterior component is the one that's attached to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, and it's part of the nervous system and consists of hypothalamic axons of neurons. So there are nerve signals that come to the posterior pituitary and controls the release of its hormones. Anterior pituitary gland is glandular epithelial tissue surrounded by blood vessels, and it produces its hormones. So the regulation of the anterior pituitary is controlled by other hormones. So please know that there are two parts to the pituitary gland, and which part is attached to the hypothalamus. Here again, we are looking at the pituitary gland. We have the anterior component, posterior component, and the infundibulum. Next, let's look at the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland here is located anterior to the windpipe. Thyroid gland is located below the larynx, and it consists of 2 broad lobes and connected by the isthmus. So there is this isthmus structure that connects the 2 lobes of the thyroid gland. 2 hormones of the thyroid gland help control caloric intake, and one helps regulate blood calcium levels and bone growth. So there are 3 hormones in total that the thyroid gland will produce, and that will help control the caloric intake and also the blood calcium levels. So looking at the structure and location, we have the larynx, and then we have inferior and anterior to that is the thyroid gland. And as we can see, we have these follicular cells that will produce the hormones that will be released into the bloodstream. So when it comes to the pathway of controlling or regulating the thyroid gland, we spoke about the hypothalamus, we spoke about the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland. So there is a pathway that connects all of them. The hypothalamus will release thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, and that will control, or that will release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary into the bloodstream, and from the bloodstream it will reach the thyroid gland, and it will produce thyroid hormones that will now stimulate the target cells for its function. So when there is thyroid hormone in the bloodstream, these thyroid hormones comes back and has a negative feedback mechanism saying, okay, now there is enough levels, stop producing TRH and TSH. So this is the thyroid hormone pathway that includes the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary and thyroid gland, and the negative feedback mechanism shown here. If the thyroid gland doesn't function properly, there can be two major disorders. If you have little or less thyroid hormone, you have hypothyroidism. Hypo is low. Hyper is high or more. So when the thyroid gland is underactive, it causes low metabolic rate. It causes fatigue and weight gain. And in infants, it can cause something called creatinism, poor growth, and bone formation. And it also can have an effect on mental development. Hyper, if you have too much thyroid hormones, that is caused due to the overactivity of the thyroid gland. This can cause high metabolic rate, restlessness, and even lead to overeating in adults. And it also causes this characteristic um, feature where the eyes tend to protrude. It's called exophthalmia. Next, let's look at the parathyroid glands. So here we see the thyroid gland from the posterior aspect, and behind the thyroid gland we have these four glands shown in blue here for the parathyroid glands. So the parathyroid gland consists of four small parathyroids located posterior of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid gland is important in regulating blood calcium and phosphorus concentrations. So parathyroid gland increases the blood calcium levels in the body and decreases the phosphate concentration. And it also involves activation of vitamin D in the kidneys and has a negative feedback mechanism to help regulate this process. So here we see the parathyroid glands located posterior to the thyroid gland. And this shows the pathway again. Think about the the broad information. You don't need to know the specific details. What students will need to know is that the parathyroid glands releases PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that gets into the bloodstream. And PTH acts on bones to release calcium. It acts on the kidneys also to activate vitamin D and increase the calcium in the bloodstream. Vitamin D also works on the gut to help absorb more calcium from the food we eat and thereby increasing the calcium levels. Once the calcium levels reaches a certain concentration, it will have a negative feedback mechanism, stopping the production of parathyroid hormone. There is also another hormone known as calcitonin, which does the opposite function of parathyroid hormone. So these two hormones in balance will be able to regulate the calcium levels in the body. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone have opposite effects. Let's next look at the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are these glands that are located superior to the kidneys. And they're shown right here as well. Adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys, enclosed in a layer of adipose tissue and connective tissue. So the adrenal gland above the kidneys. And they regulate the stress response, the fight or flight response. So looking at the function of the adrenal gland, it is also under the control of the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus will produce a creatine releasing hormone that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce ACTH, anterior cortical the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and students will not really need to know these terms, but know the bigger picture here. ACTH will stimulate the adrenal cortex, the adrenal gland, to produce cortisols, which will then go into the bloodstream and it will inhibit protein synthesis, promote fatty acid release, and even stimulate glucose formation so that there is energy for the body. And that will also have a negative feedback saying now we have enough, so stop producing these stimulating hormones. So let's look at the pancreas. The pancreas is the organ in the body. We talked about how they have both an exocrine and endocrine function. For this lecture, we will focus on the endocrine function. And when we talk about the pancreas in the digestive system, we will talk about their exocrine function. A pancreas has both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. The pancreatic hormones help regulate the blood glucose levels. They are produced by the pancreatic islets, also known as islets of Langerhans. They have two cell types, alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon, beta cells secrete insulin. So here we have the pancreas located here, opens up into the duodenum, almost at the same point where the gallbladder opens up into the duodenum in the GI tract. So they will produce their hormones, they will produce their exocrine organs and that will go into the gut. But they will produce their endocrine products and they will go into the bloodstream. So shown here by these capillaries, red structures. So just know the broad function of glucagon and insulin. Glucagon increases the blood glucose levels. It helps break down glucagon to produce glucose. Insulin, on the other hand, will decrease the blood levels of glucose by storing it as glucagon, by forming glucagon and storing it. So insulin and glucagon again have opposite functions and they help maintain a relatively stable blood glucose concentration. So let's look at how they function here. When we have a certain meal, when we eat, it increases the blood sugar level in the bloodstream because it's been absorbed by the gut, and that will stimulate the beta cells in the pancreas to release insulin, and this insulin will then help take this excess glucose and store it up as glucagon or even in fat cells. Now, and when at some point, if there is low glucose level in the blood, these can release glucose again into the blood. Similarly, when we exercise, that will use up the blood sugars and that will stimulate the alpha cells to release glucagon, and glucagon will act on its organs to break down glycogen, forming more glucose and releasing it into the blood. So that's the pathway that's used here. When the pancreatic cells, the insulin production does not work properly, it can cause a disease, and that's called diabetes mellitus. There are two types of diabetes mellitus, type 1, which is insulin dependent, type 2, which is insulin resistant. So type 1, it's an autoimmune disorder that destroys the beta cells and therefore it cannot produce insulin. Type 2 diabetes is when the insulin is produced, but they are no longer effective. You need more and more higher concentrations of insulin to be recognized by their target organs. Let's look at the pineal gland. Pineal gland is this very small gland that is again going to be part of the diencephalon above the midbrain, as we can see here. Pineal gland is located on the upper portion of the thalamus. It secretes a hormone known as melatonin. Melatonin is involved in the regulation of the circadian rhythm. This is the sleep-wake cycles of the body. Melatonin helps us initiate sleep, help us fall asleep. So as long as you know that pineal gland produces melatonin, that helps in the sleep cycles, that should be good for that. And then we have the thymus. Thymus lies between the lungs behind the sternum. So that's a structure that we saw, I mentioned, is more prominent in children and less prominent in adults. The function of thymus is to help differentiate T lymphocytes, which are important for immunity, largest in children and shrinks with age. And here we see the thymus located right here. Thymus is located behind the sternum, of the anterior chest wall. As we can see, thymus is much larger in infants and children, and they become much smaller in adults. Then we also discussed there were organs, endocrine organs associated with sexual function, and that here we see the ovaries and testes. Ovaries are located in females that produce ova, and then we also have uh, the testes in males that produce hormones that will regulate sperm production. Then some other organs with endocrine function, we have the stomach and the intestine. They will produce certain hormones that will have certain enteric regulation. And we all have the placenta, the connection between a baby in the uterus and also the mother. The placenta also produces certain hormones that will help regulate certain functions in the baby. So that's all we have for this lecture. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.